Good. I'm not quite sure what's happening with the microphone, but hopefully you can hear a little bit better if I stand just a little bit closer. Firstly, thank you very much for welcome to country to the Kaurna people. And I've now attended hundreds of functions where there's been a welcome, and it's the first time that I've had an interactive experience in relation to the welcome. So I thank you for that, and I applaud you. It's a great joy to be here to be able to speak about children, communities, families, family support. For those that aren't aware, I started my involvement in the not-for-profit sector when I was at university a very long time ago. And my very first involvement was visiting the most vulnerable families in the inner city of Sydney. So as a very young person, I was experiencing those families that are at the extreme edge of disadvantage and poverty, and their children. And shortly thereafter, I was to be involved in another group which worked with families where the child was at risk of being taken into care and placed into out-of-home care. So this conference, many years later, is a joy to be at. And in a sense, it reflects how far we've come from those days. It reflects it in terms of our understanding of the issues, not only surrounding families, as Carl's indicated this morning, but our much greater understanding of those sorts of interventions that are necessary to make a difference. In some senses, I'm always called upon to, I suppose, in a sense, read the signs of the times. Those of you that may be Catholic would be aware of that expression that arose out of the Vatican II in the 1960s, and the Church was called to look at the signs of the times. I'm reminded of a wonderful quip or a story about the Home Secretary from the United Kingdom in a previous government who was very fond of drink. And he was on an official engagement to Peru. Dinner came and he certainly imbibed very actively. He was seated next to a guest resplendent in a red and white outfit. And suddenly the music started and the Home Secretary turned to the guest next to him and said, "Would you like to dance?" And the person said no, and there are three reasons. Firstly, you're drunk. Secondly, it happens to be the national anthem of Peru. And thirdly, I happen to be the Archbishop of Lima. So my view is always be in a sober state when reading the signs of our times. But I want to go back a bit into another role that I had prior to being with the Productivity Commission, and that was as the Commissioner for Community and Disability Services in New South Wales. And in July of 2001, there was a conference put on by the Australian Early Childhood Association, which talked about children and excellence. And the paper that I was asked to prepare was called Children's Rights, We Cannot Wait. And it's interesting to reflect that the underpinning for what we are here today is about a significant change in the way in which we see children in our society and our community. In the 1800s, children were regarded as no more than possessions, mere chattels of adults. They were things. They were not regarded as individuals in their own right. They certainly had no rights. And indeed, in some parts of the world today, that continues to exist. But they were, in fact, mere possessions. There was a significant change in the early 1900s, but that change was to treat children as humans in the making. Not quite human yet, but they one day will be humans. But it was only in 1989, 10 years after the International Year of Children, that changed with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, where for the first time in human history, children were regarded as individual persons, indeed legal persons. The Save the Children, in their vision statement, encapsulates it in a very simple but I think very elegant way. It calls for a world which respects and values each child, a world which listens to children and learns, a world where all children have hope and opportunity. And surely those expressions are the very thing that underpin the work that you currently do, either through Communities for Children programs or early childhood development programs or any aspect of that. Critical to that, however, was another notion which you've also embraced. The Convention on the Rights of Children was not a document that was ever meant to put children in conflict with adults. It was never meant to be a document that pitted the rights of children against the rights of the rest of the community. Indeed, the Convention enshrined the notion of how important family was when it said this: family is the fundamental group of society and the natural environment for the growth and well-being of all its members, and particularly children. But it also placed the family within the broader context of community, exactly what you have done, exactly what C4C does, exactly what we do today. Indeed, we now see people that are disadvantaged more generally as people being within a community. And my hope and my aim is that practice in the community service sector will become community-centric. Today, in this sector, we talk about person-centred care, and that's fine. But one of the dangers with this, you see the person, be it a child or an adult, as isolated from the rest of the community and the families. Indeed, in the area of disability, we learnt a very salient lesson in relation to this. For many years, people with disabilities were a forgotten problem, a forgotten part of our community. And more importantly, we saw them only in a sense as part of a family and nothing else. And then we created the notion of person-centred care and support, which was extremely important, where we centred on the needs and the aspirations of the individual. But what we suddenly did, without actually realising it, is that the inner circle that surrounds you and me, our family and our neighbourhood, was in fact fully replaced by the ring of professional support. Indeed, we further isolated the person with disabilities from their families, their neighbourhoods and their communities. So we went to person-centred, but actually missed one of the most important aspects that people live within families, neighbourhoods and communities. And today we would now see person-centred in a broader notion. Indeed, one of the great challenges is to convert community services into community-centric services. And it doesn't move away from person-centred, but it better places it. The third aspect about this conference, which is also extraordinarily significant, is the use of the word "with children" and the importance of their voice. As Save the Children says, a world which listens to children and learns. And this is incredibly important because, in a sense, you may say you're listening, but are you actually hearing what they're saying? When I was Community and Disability Services Commissioner, we oversighted the provision of out-of-home care by government and non-government agencies throughout New South Wales. We conducted an inquiry into the voices of children in care, that is, children from about the age of 8 through to early teenagehood that were in foster care and residential care. And we asked them what they wanted from the system, because we'd endlessly heard from government and the department itself and from researchers. But we actually wanted to know what children wanted. And they told us in loud and clear terms. The first thing is they wanted a relationship with their natural family. No matter how destructive the original family may have been, they needed it. The second thing, however, is that they wanted a meaningful relationship with their care workers. Absolutely critical. The difference between the government service delivery and non-government service delivery was profound. In all of the surveys we had done, we'd show an enormous turnover of caseworkers and carers in the government system, with a much less reduced turnover in the not-for-profit sector. But the children told us that the first model was completely unacceptable. It didn't meet their needs. They didn't want to deal with a dozen caseworkers whilst they were in care. And that, in a sense, for me, was the great wake-up call. They told us what we intuitively knew. They may have told us what research would have told us, but their voice was powerful and important in trying to change the system. And today it's important in you reshaping and continuously shaping this particular agenda. Today I just want to reflect, however, in a different space. The other day I was asked to speak at the World Congress of Dietetics. You might think that's a very strange thing to talk about, but they wanted to do a session on Indigenous disadvantage. And as was indicated, I happened to convene the government working group made up of the 9 governments on overcoming Indigenous disadvantage, which produces a report of indicators each 2 years. So I was on a panel. I spoke about the big problem of Indigenous disadvantage in Australia. The New Zealanders got up and spoke about the big problem of disadvantage for the Maori people. And the third one was from Canada. And he got up and he spoke about community gardens in Indigenous communities in northern Canada. At the end of the talk, some people came and spoke to me, some people came and spoke to the New Zealanders, and there was a queue, huge queue, of people talking to the fellow about community gardens. And the point about that is that in one sense the community gardens are exceptionally important. They, in fact, have a very strong community purpose and focus. But sometimes we have to step back and look at the systemic issues. And just briefly, without intruding on morning tea, I want to do that. I want you to think about the system within which you are engaged, because the sessions that you've got will talk about the practice. The one thing I know is everyone in this room thinks the program they're delivering is the best there is, and I know that nobody would stand up and say we've got a lousy program and we should get out of it. But systemically, it isn't true. It isn't true that every program we deliver is wonderful. It isn't true that every community service provider does a great job. It isn't true that every dollar we invest in this area is well spent. And we know that to be the case. But there is optimism. Today in Australia, over 640,000 children from birth to 5 years of age now have access to early childhood settings, long day care, family occasional care, and 213,000 additionally are in preschools. We've got 340,000 children in out-of-hours school care today. We've got 140,000, including yourselves, in the areas of early childhood education and care, health workforce and family support. These are extraordinary numbers compared to what they used to be, and the investment that we make in this is very substantial. Today, 1.5 million children in that age group access early childhood education and care, out-of-school hours care, child health and family support, 1.5 million. And today we now have the National Early Childhood Agenda, which many of you are part of. Some not, but many are. And of course the quality agenda in that takes into account a number of key areas that are relevant beyond just simply that agenda, but more widely. Educational programs, children's health and safety, the physical environment, staffing, relationships with children, collaborative partnerships with families and communities, leadership and service management, and so on. So we've already made great gains in terms of developing a long-term strategy for early childhood in relation to early childhood education and care. Perhaps less so in the area of general family support and services. But I just want you to think about a number of key areas and be challenged by them. The first is to actually understand the context within which we and you now operate. The second is, what is the research really telling us? And the first question that has to be asked is there really a problem or not? And if so, what is it? The third is, how do we know where to invest? Governments have a notion called additionality. It's a very simple concept. For every $1 government spends on behalf of the citizenry, you and I, it needs to achieve some increased value. Governments should not spend $1 if that dollar is already being spent or achieves no greater benefit. So when governments decide to invest another dollar or another $1 billion, it's right to say, what is the additional benefit to the community overall of that investment? How would you know how to advise government in relation to that? How do we know what programs are cost-effective relative to each other? So in this room, if I asked you to all put up the programs side by side, how would you be able to tell me, if I were government, where I should spend the dollars, the extra or additional dollars? What would be the basis that you would in fact advise government on doing so? Another issue we want to just touch on is looking at universal versus targeting, a significant issue in the Australian scene, particularly in relation to the rollout of the Early Childhood Development Framework. The notion of integration and how much that will in fact enhance and add value, and what are the difficulties with that. And the last point is just, where do we start? I want to deal with these very briefly because I'm assuming that you have a great knowledge of this, but let's just take the context. The context is radically different to when I started in a voluntary capacity in these areas. And I should say I've never been in a paid capacity within the community service sector at all. In the past, researchers believed that human ability could be represented by simply a single measure, and that was usually the intelligent quotient, the IQ. This view has been replaced by a focus on cognitive and socio-emotional abilities. Cognitive abilities are intellectual skills, while emotional abilities include emotional and relational skills such as persistence, self-control, communication, and what some people call soft skills, but many of us may regard as very important. Both of these, both cognitive and socio-economic skills, are essential to children's development. We now understand that. We understand that the interaction of cognitive and socio-emotional skills is particularly important in early years of life. And a growing body of research demonstrates that adverse experience in this period, as if we didn't already know, such as abuse or neglect, impair the development of young children, and that follows through to adulthood. So in a sense, the environment within which we operate is now very different. The research that underpins the work you do in the last 20 to 30 years has been significant and extremely different to that which existed much earlier, although I'm sure that there were people that proclaimed these views. The importance of understanding that basis gives us the basis on which we actually start to design these services going forward. Indeed, C4C came out of that understanding. It came out of this understanding of these interconnections. The whole early childhood development framework at the moment, linking education and care, is based on these particular research understandings. But it is important. The second piece of work that underpins both now and the future is the work around well-being. The international work on well-being now starts to show us a new way of determining what is important in communities. Today, coming from the Productivity Commission, most of our staff are economists. I'm not, and we are regarded as, the primary body of advisors to the government in economic, social and other areas. But previously, economists used to measure the well-being of a nation by a single measure, a bit like the IQ, except in this case it was GDP, gross domestic product per head of population. And if that single figure increased, we said that nations were improving and progressing. We used to say that that measured the well-being of the nation. Today, you and I know that that's not sufficient. So what are we starting to look at in terms of well-being? We start to look at what is important in terms of people's general happiness or general disposition. And what are they? The 6 key domains that we've identified in our work in the not-for-profit sector are important for you, at least 3 of them. The first was connectedness within the community. Connectedness to each other is a very significant element of people's well-being. A second is engagement in meaningful activity. A third, and critically important, is the ability to influence one's own life. That is, to make choices and take chances, to take risks. The others are about sense of self, which is about self-respect, a sense of safety within the community, and the last one is what they call consumption, the ability to acquire goods and services. But let me just take the middle one, the one about the influence, the ability to influence. This, of course, should underpin all family practice. All family practice, including C4C, must be based on the understanding that what we're about is trying to enhance people's ability to take greater control over their own lives, not only as children but as adults. The notion that we give is in fact a notion that we've moved well away from. What we now do is we provide supports and services and resources that allow people to gain the skills and the capacities necessary to be able to exercise choice. In a previous book on family practice, it was called The Optimistic Agenda. The optimistic agenda is not that I feel just happy. It's actually a belief that vulnerable men and women and vulnerable children and young people have it within their capacity to in fact take control of their lives over time. The optimism is in the person, and good family practitioners understand that. Some would now describe this as a strength-based approach rather than a deficit-based model. But put it aside, it's very important in the work you're doing in Communities for Children, because the ultimate aim is to build that capacity and strength. The third one, but related to that, and it is important in this area, is the work on resilience in young people. The work on resilience gives us a clue, and you're working in this space. And what are some of the key aspects of resilience, and this is particularly in relation to schools? The first, and surprisingly most important according to the Resilience Resource Centre, which is operated by the Mental Health Council of Australia, is optimism. That is the learnt skills by which we are hopeful about our futures. This is not a soft issue. It's about the development of skills for people that are otherwise not hopeful and indeed not optimistic. And many of the children and families that you work with fall into this category. So one of the skills that you actually have to teach young people, either formally or informally, is the notion of hope and optimism. It's very interesting in the reviews that have been done and the evaluations that have been done in a lot of these areas, including early childhood activities, integrated family centres and so on. But even for homeless people, there's a program that teaches higher education to homeless and marginalised people called the Clementi program. The participants in that rate as the greatest outcome is the sense of hope, and it's a critically important element. The second, however, is this: it's about relationships. In the work done on resilient schools, both high schools and primary schools, the three most important elements is relationships, second, a high expectation of all students, and the third is what they call opportunities to participate, which we might call flexible learning. But central to this is this notion of hope and relationships. So let's just deal with some of these questions very quickly. Is there a problem? Are we trying to fix a problem, or are we actually creating a problem with which to fix? Many of you would say that's a ridiculous question. It's obvious that there's a problem. But not necessarily so. One of the papers that I was looking at the other day, called Circles of Care, the struggle to strengthen child development systems through the Pathways to Prevention program, by a number of authors, started off by this statement. It said, social scientists and epidemiologists have observed that while the latter half of the 20th century ushered in changes that increased the general quality of life for many in our society, these changes also contributed to what Brenner, you'd know them, referred to as a kind of disarray, a chaos that threatens the social and ethical development of our children, particularly those growing up outside the mainstreaming communities that have been marginalised by social change. This evidenced itself in greater levels of disruptive behaviour, delinquency, depression, suicide, substance use, lack of connection, poor school performance, all of which have been reported amongst youth of many societies, including Australia. But in a sense, that may overstate the problem in Australia to some extent, because the work of the Australian Early Development Index, with which you'd all be familiar, which looks at a number of areas, has in fact found that relative to most other countries, in many areas, Australians' children do reasonably well. But for 23% of children, they in fact fall within what we call the developmentally vulnerable group. They are in the the bottom 10% of the national scores. And it rises to 47% amongst Indigenous children who had particular difficulties with language and cognitive skills. The Growing Up in Australia, the longitudinal study being conducted by FAXIA, also says the same thing, that the majority of children seem to be doing relatively well by most indicators, but that there is a subset that is deeply disadvantaged in relation to this. And there's a reason why I say that. When we looked at the early childhood development, which I was a commissioner on, the presiding commissioner on, we were looking at the workforce. That is the whole of the workforce in the areas that I've referred to, family support right through to preschool and early school education. And again, the evidence there was not clear that there was a huge problem for all children. Indeed, the contrary may well be the case. What it shows when you look at all of the research is that most children are doing well, but within that there is a cohort that are in fact deeply disadvantaged. Why this becomes important is related to the second issue, and it is an issue, and that is, where do you actually put the effort? Where do we actually put the effort? The issue about universal versus targeting has been as round as long as Methuselah, and in this room there will be all sorts of different opinions. Indeed, today we don't want to speak about it in a sense because it forces you to make choices. But that's exactly what governments do each and every day. So a question for you, and given that C4C is largely targeted to disadvantages, maybe less so, is where do you think the additional dollars should be spent? In the early childhood development area, we have as a community, the 9 governments on behalf of the citizenry has decided to invest heavily in universal programs. And that is probably a good thing. The difficulty, however, is in funding the universal, have we in fact squeezed out the ability to fund the programs in the areas that would provide the most benefit for the most disadvantaged? This is not an idle question. In the early childhood development framework, the Indigenous-focused services have been excluded from the framework because they are so far behind the quality standards now obtained. The danger with that model is that all the money will go to the universal, for which the benefits are marginal at best, but not negative. And in fact, those that are in greatest need will miss out. Now, these are big questions. Now, people will jump up and say, well, you've got to educate everybody to a certain level and universal access does certain things. Now, that's true. But there is an issue about where you target the programs and where you target the dollars and cents. And here I think we are starting to understand this. Even in relation to the CFC program, the national evaluation that was undertaken found, as you were well aware, 3 things. It found that there was evidence that C4C had positive impacts. The positive impacts were that fewer children were living in a jobless household, parents reported less hostile or harsh parenting practices, and parents felt more effective in their roles as parents. Positive. But the authors of the evaluation raised 2 significant questions. They said, firstly, a legitimate question to be asked would be whether an extra expenditure on service coordination and community development has been justified, or to put it another way, whether it would have been more effective to spend the resources on more direct services. That's their question. In short, and paraphrasing, they say, indeed, positive changes in relation to the parental involvement in community activities, joblessness and social cohesion supports the idea that community embeddedness may have an additional effect on children and families, may have. The second question they said is the evaluation suggests that the C4C model can make an important contribution to the family and community contexts in which disadvantaged children grow up and in terms of their well-being. It then says this, whether the C4C is a strategy that can sustain benefits in the long term and whether long-term exposure to C4C initiatives at a later stage in operation can produce greater benefits is as yet unclear. And so I think that's a terrific evaluation. It indicates and it's quite a substantial evaluation, where the strengths are. But it bravely raises questions that we as a sector should be prepared to answer. Some of those answers will come through longitudinal studies of the cohort of children going through CFC now. Some of those will come through program evaluations. But my point for raising it is that these are the questions we have to ask systemically. It's not good enough to say Australians should invest in early childhood. We are. The question is additional investment. Where and on what basis is the evidence? I am conscious of the time, but I just reflect on the 3, if I can, most important early studies that have been done in the United States. For example, Head Start and Early Head Start, which you'd be aware of, began in the 1965s. And so far, 27 million children have enrolled in Head Start and Early Head Start. And in the year 2010, the US government spent more than $7 billion on this program. The evaluations of that are very interesting, because the evaluations show that Early Head Start, which deals with infants under the age of 3, had substantial benefits. In contrast, the Head Start, which goes from 3 up, the benefits are much less. And they actually put dollar terms in relation to this. All of this, however, was targeted for disadvantaged children, and I'll come to an issue in a moment. The second one, the high scope preschool program, which again is a seminal piece of work, again which was done amongst Afro-American children only in highly disadvantaged backgrounds, showed that in fact the cost benefits ranged dramatically depending on which stage this was introduced. The benefits were very substantial at different stages. but the greatest benefit came in long term from the reduction of those going to jail, the reduction in the crime rate. Why that's significant is that the USA has a very different jail population than we do. It is largely Afro-American, and it is a huge percentage of the Afro-American male population. The gains they found were in fact less men going to jail, basically. The third one was looking at the Chicago Child Parents Centre. And here again they did a cost-benefit analysis again. And the result was interesting again. It said this: for every dollar invested in preschool program, the return was estimated at $10. This compares with a return on investment of $3 and to $8 for school-age programs. Now, my point again is not to say anything about the programs, but that is the sort of work we need to do. And we need to be fair dinkum about the fact that not all of what we do actually delivers the same benefits. And what they were prepared to do is to look at the program not just as a whole, but break it down and say for this cohort and for this cohort. And in Australia, we need to do the same. Why is this very significant? It's very significant because there are areas of real disadvantage that we need to meet, and we do need to have the skills and the resources to do so. Today in Australia, using a poverty line of 50% of the median income, 575,000 children in Australia live below the poverty line. That is 17% of all Australian children are below this line. That's a huge number of children. Now, you can dispute, as many do, whether or not the poverty line is the right measure, and there are new measures, deprivation measures, exclusion measures, and what they call financial poverty measures. But put that aside. And of course, a very high percentage of those children are in families where the main income is social security. So again, knowing that, where and how would we target programs? Early childhood development programs, communities for children programs, and more generally. Further than that, we know from the research that's been done over at least the last decade and a half that disadvantage in Australia is locationally based. And C4C absolutely responded to that research and knowledge that this was targeted to placements. But again, there are many who actually argue against that when it comes to resourcing and program delivery. The effect of this, however, is very significant. So, for example, if we look at location and we take remote Australia, where a significant percentage of Indigenous people live, what does it mean? It means a huge investment in terms of skilling up Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, to be able to become workers. Currently, it is very difficult to get Certificate 2 workers. The new quality standards take it to Certificate 4, diploma and qualified teachers. We don't have the resources to be able to train people in communities, and we don't have the housing to be able to house people if they go into those communities. These are major investments. The costs of providing C4C or early childhood development programs in remote Australia is significantly higher than in urban areas. Are we prepared to make that investment? And if we are prepared to make that investment, are we prepared to reduce investment in any other areas? Let me conclude in this space just by saying this. I don't want anyone to read into what I'm saying that I'm against universal services. The conversation that the sector and governments need to have is this: what are the universal services that should be provided? What are the services that are needed to be targeted? And what are the intensive services that we need to provide, these three levels? And is there a common agreement about what should be universally provided? Is there a common agreement about what requires some targeting? Is there a common agreement about intensive services? And are we therefore prepared to make the resource allocation, which affects the quality of staff and skilling, necessary? Those are the sorts of things we look forward to if you are going to develop a sustainable investment strategy in early childhood development. Let me just conclude with two other bits. One is about integration. And I should also say that I'm a director on the Benevolent Society. A couple of our staff are here, and we run early childhood centres and integrated family and children's services in New South Wales and particularly in Queensland. And I've just visited a few of them up there. And I'm a great advocate of integrated services. But the question is, again, how do we demonstrate the added value of those? One of the dangers for integration is suddenly you actually not only integrate the services, you also aggregate the amount you spend on it. So if you have in fact 4 or 5 siloed services being provided in a co-located basis, nobody actually knows how much it costs. With an integrated family and children's service, everybody knows how much it costs, and it looks a lot. Now you might think that's a strange thing to say, but it's a significant issue. Because today, if you have an integrated family and children's service or a C4C program and the price tag is 1.5 million or 2 million a year, people are going to look at that. If it's 5 or 6 people contributing in departments, nobody will ever be able to work it out. It'll be lost in the mayhem. The question for going forward with integration, which I totally believe in, is how will we justify those expenditures? Now you might think I'm concentrating a lot on money. Well, I am from the government, and that's what governments do. But the issue here is it's also about quality and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. One of the research which I didn't refer to about early childhood development, particularly in relation to centre-based care, is that it is all dependent on the quality of the experience, and that goes to the quality of the personnel, the staff, the quality of the carers, educators, and the same too in family practice. And so investment in this area is not simply in the physical build, it's actually in the people. And so the price tags for these are high because you want the right calibre of people with the right qualifications, whether they are child health workers or family support workers, educators or carers. So the question again is, how will you demonstrate the benefits in a real and concrete terms, as a sector and as individual providers? Now, some of you will be able to do that easily, and others of you will struggle with this particular area. But the impacts that I'm talking about include those areas that I've referred to in the wellbeing stuff. It's not about the number of children that you put through, it's the difference you've made. How will we know the difference that's been made to children, their parents and their families? What are the spillover effects in terms of community connectedness, engagement in meaningful activity, a sense of self-respect, a sense of security? Now, in the Benevolent Society example, and we're certainly not perfect, we've started to integrate all of those questions into surveys of all clients in family and children's services. And we can now start to tell over a period of time whether the programs are in fact increasing or not increasing those particular areas. Now, it's early days, and that's a practical manifestation of what I'm saying. Everything I've spoken about has a practical element to it. And when we talk about wellbeing as being a new way of measuring community wellbeing, we then say, well, how do we do it? It's not about putting dollar numbers on it, but it is to say that for that investment, these are the sorts of benefits for this particular group or these particular groups. The last comment that I want to make, and it is the last one, so that you can all go to morning tea, it's about starting from where we are today. One of the issues about the community area is that we already have a range of services in the community that are provided by local governments and others. And part of the creative thinking is how do we use those as the basis for development. Let me take a very high one and then let me go to a very low one. One is about schools itself. Schools in Australia are now the central most important point of connectedness for communities. With the loss of extended family, the reduction in the importance of neighbourhood, the loss of lifetime employment with an employer, and the decline of formal religion, the only two things that now stand in Australia that connects people are schools and supermarkets. The last one's not the great one. So as a consequence of that, we're now starting to say, how can we use schools as a centre? And you'll notice the New South Wales government has reintroduced the idea of community hubs, where the schools will now be part of an integrated set of other services in deeply disadvantaged areas. This is not a new concept, it is an old concept, but it is being resurrected. So we say, let's use the school, which is the centre of connectedness, to extend beyond. This is not about turning teachers into welfare workers or principals into heads of social work activities. These are about co-located and maybe integrated services. But let me take a much simpler example, and that is playgrounds and parenting groups. And today, if we look at what's happening in some of the other countries, I was talking to a person that's just done a Churchill Fellowship in relation to playgrounds, And she went overseas to examine playgrounds thinking it would be about the design, the physical design of the playgrounds, and she's an urban designer. She came back and she said the extraordinary thing was that what was most important is the development of relationships between the community members around the playground. The playgrounds in the countries she visited actually have workers, that are community development workers attached to the playground itself. And they don't see it just as a physical space, they see it as a space of community connectedness. Now we know that in some of the C4C programs you build on that. The same thing with the simple playgroup. We now know around Australia that the playgroup, and many of you would be involved in this, have taken on a new meaning. It's taking something very simple but understanding its potential to do other things with it. And in a sense, this is the stuff we have to really look at. It's cost effective, it works from the basis of where community is, and in many senses, it really is about genuine bottoms-up community development. So not everything is grand. In this space, it's often turning the simple into something much better. And that's where I'd like to leave it. We are going forward with a dynamic child development agenda. I'm certainly not responsible for any of it. We're a body that just does inquiries and provides advice to government. But I think there are tough questions coming up for which this sector has to be prepared to ask them and answer them. There will be greater scrutiny, and I know that will please you no end. But there will be greater scrutiny because of the reasons I've raised. It's not just the dollars and cents, it's what the dollars and cents need to buy in terms of quality teachers, quality carers, quality workers generally. My very last point, however, and it is a very clear one, whatever we do, however, we have a special obligation to children who are in disadvantaged circumstances. There is no question in my mind that as a society we should be judged by the way in which we deal with our most vulnerable in society. And for me, there's no question that that is about vulnerable children and vulnerable families. You're committed to that. You're in it, you believe in it, and you're doing it. But at the end of the day, we do have to demonstrate that in fact makes the difference we claim. And if it does, I think we can be confident that governments into the future on behalf of the citizens will fund it. So I congratulate you for the work you do, but the challenges have only just begun. Thanks.